This is the Chucktown Wind Report Extended Weekday Outlook from Tuesday, September the 8th through Friday, September the 11th. Okay, so we've had an interesting last few days with this area of troughing along our coastline that has just been persistent and pesky. And we did have our high pressure built to the north that was trying to wedge down a northeast, east-northeast flow. It did make it down here, and the gradient was tighter, and we were expecting to see some moderate to somewhat strong winds. However, we did have an upper level low that sort of drifted down across into the Gulf of Mexico, and that provided a lot of moisture up from the south to meet that boundary right along our coastline. That's why we saw a lot of that streaming moisture in on Saturday and Sunday, especially Sunday, right along the coastline. So that sort of prevented the build from happening, but as things sort of dried out a little bit yesterday, and we were able to see that moderate build, 15 to 16 knots. What was left over, the east-northeasterlies and the easterlies build in and then fade out later. And so that's going to be continuing to be the process today as we see this Appalachian high pressure providing sort of a northerly wind, maybe even north-northeast later or early to mid this morning. And eventually the wind field will probably shift a little bit more easterly. Now we do have a high pressure ridge built out here in the Atlantic, and that should be providing us a southeast wind. So we're going to be seeing probably a southeast to east-southeast wind this afternoon during some true sea breezing. And we do have a lot of moisture off the coastline, so we'll have to watch for lots of rain and thunderstorms to make its way on shore. Now this little area of disturbance that has moved up into the Florida Panhandle is expected to continue north and then dry out underneath this dome of high pressure. I think for the most part we're looking at it moving across the mid-states, upstates to mid-states of the Carolinas, and what that will probably do is provide a decent area of inland troughing. Now when we get that set up, we have this high pressure ridge belt out here, and that's going to be providing that southerly synoptic flow into this sort of area of inland troughing or Piedmont troughing. We end up with a decent sea breeze build along the coastline. So we're looking at a pretty decent build for tomorrow. Models are starting to come into agreement with that, where we see 15 to 20 knots of wind on a pretty healthy sea breeze with this inland troughing set up, and most likely weakening a little bit on Thursday to come down a little bit. So we could say for today, on a brief mention, we could probably say 9 to 13 knots off of a slight gradient, maybe 10 to 14 knots on an east-southeast or southeast flow. However, these rains and storms moving ashore are going to really kind of make things soggy and messy. As we get into tomorrow, when this area comes up this way and this high pressure builds in and dries the coastline out, we're actually able to get a decent sea breeze circulation going. We'll probably see these numbers start to come up on a more of a south or south-southwest flow, and probably get to where we can see 14 to 18 knots or even higher on a decent sea breeze build. Now when we get into Thursday, as this area of inland troughing weakens, we may see the sea breezes drop down a couple of notches. So we'll say 12 to 16 knots with potential if that inland troughing does hold up. As we get into Friday, probably see that weaken a little bit. We have a boundary dropping down towards the southeast region. It's going to take its time. It's more of an east-west trough right now, and it's going to sort of meander down into the southeast or towards the southeast and possibly break off into a couple of different areas of troughing that might make it over the coastline. But for right now, we're getting ahead of ourselves on that. I would say Friday be a weaker day, and we'll have to keep watching this area of high pressure built out here in the Atlantic to keep our sea breezes going. So let's take a look at our radar, and right now we can see these areas of rains and storms already starting to show up on radar nearby and likely to start showing up on our shoreline at some point this morning. Now with the southeast wind, we have a north wind right now, and you can see how it's sort of suppressing some of these rains and storms to our south, but not for long, because once that wind shifts to more of an east or southeast, it's going to be more inviting for these areas to make it right on shore and have a free flow over the coastline. Okay, infrared loop of the area, the tropical Atlantic. Here's that little disturbance making its way into northern Florida. We also have this area disturbance out here over Bermuda that's expected to have somewhat of a decent environment for development. However, cooler waters out here usually inhibit these storms from being able to really make anything of themselves, except for maybe a subtropical or extratropical characteristics. And you can see the upper level low here in the Gulf of Mexico. It's rather dry at this point, but it does provide a steady train of moisture up from the south, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. Here's Grace way out here, a little tropical wave to the west of Grace. If we go to our earth.nullschool.net map, I did want to take a quick look. Here's Charleston. Here you can see that southeasterly flow heading up the coastline. Here's this little area of low pressure moving into northern Florida now, and we can almost see it in this area right here, that little bit of a northerly flow off that Appalachian high pressure. And as we get into the upper levels of the atmosphere, I wanted to take a look at the 500 HPA, and you can see this upper level low right here over just entering into the Gulf of Mexico. That's the one that plagued us over the weekend with all that moisture streaming up. So the further away it gets and the drier it gets, the less moisture we're going to have pumping up into our area. Okay, let's look at data scope from weather flow in our area. Right now we're seeing north-northeast winds. The harbor showing a tinge of northeast, and we're looking at 8 knots and 4 knots along the beaches where we're seeing some land shadowing effects keep those winds down. More of an offshore flow. I definitely wanted to take a look at these models for today and verify if we're going to have a southeast flow. Let those load for just a minute. And well, this one's taking just a minute here. Here we go. Okay, so for this afternoon, as we go through and look at what the model outputs are, we see some of the higher resolution models. The HRRR, the HER 3 kilometer, is keeping an easterly flow for the most part until later this afternoon and then drawing it southeast. And then we're also seeing the NAM 5 kilometer doing the same, almost the same exact thing with it. So a lot of models are in agreement for the southeast flow for today. I think it's just going to be kind of wet and messy. Now as we get into tomorrow, some of the higher resolution models drop off because they just don't go out that far, but our medium resolution models and our long range models are all starting to come into agreement for an afternoon build. And that could even go on through the nighttime with a little bit of a nocturnal jet. But as far as the build goes, we're seeing teens, we're seeing low to mid-teens for the most part, except for the Canadian model, which is yellow. That'd be our one lone wolf that seems to want to do its own thing here. But for the most part, the other models are all coming into agreement for a build for tomorrow. A little bit weaker on Thursday. There is a bump later in the afternoon, and then as we get into Friday, we see things really kind of drop off of a southwesterly zonal flow ahead of that large area I was talking about earlier to the west, that frontal boundary to the west, moving towards the area. So that's what the models are showing. I have to agree with tomorrow's build. Today it's going to be kind of wet and messy. Tomorrow I think we have a really good shot this week at getting some decent sea breezing off of that inland troughing and the high pressure ridge out in the Atlantic. Okay, so let's look at the tropics. Okay, we have that area down in the Gulf of Mexico. They're giving it 10%. Disorganized showers. Environmental conditions are unfavorable due to strong upper level winds and dry mid-level air, so we're not expecting very much from that. It's moving ashore now. Here's the other area disturbance out here by Bermuda, and environmental conditions are expected to become somewhat conducive for development. And I think they say somewhat because the water temperatures out here are lower and it does not really provide a lot of fuel for systems. Now if it does develop into anything, it'll probably head off to the north. It may become subtropical in nature only due to the cooler waters giving it a cold core, and that's what is characteristic of subtropical storms. So here's Grace. Grace is moving to the west at 17 knots or 20 miles per hour. The winds are 40 miles per hour and the pressure is up to 1006. And she has a long road ahead of her. She has some dry air and a little bit of shear going on right now, and she's heading straight for these islands. So several hurdles to go through. She is sitting right along the intertropical convergence zone. She's drawing a little bit of moisture, but as we look at the Saharan air layer, you can see some of this output in the last couple of frames where she's spitting out some of that dust that she ingested a little bit earlier on from the Saharan desert dust that is at the mid-levels. And you can see she's really struggling to stay in form as that dust is still wrapped into the center. Look at the visible imagery loop. We don't see a very impressive looking storm at this point. We see disorganized shower activity. It looks like the center might even be displaced. The actual center of circulation looks to be somewhere out ahead of this area of convection, so it looks like we may even have a trailing low pressure at the higher levels, which means further disorganization. If we look at the rainbow top, you can see the convection kind of blowing up a little bit overnight, and we'll have to see what happens today. She does still have a little bit of a feeder band off the intertropical convergence zone coming up from the south, so there's a little bit of promise for her to stay together for further out to the west, and the National Hurricane Center is keeping her as a tropical storm at least until hitting the islands, and that's probably what's going to do it for her, and I'd be surprised if she makes it through the islands. So here's the tracks heading straight for the Leeward Islands into Puerto Rico, at least for 96 hours out from now, and we'll see what happens from there. So here's our precipitable water, and here's Grace chugging along. You can see that there is some moisture available to her south, and she's going to continue to stay afloat based on that moisture being able to be pumped in. And then we can see the last frames here, out here by Bermuda, where that area is swirling together with lots of moisture to the south of that pulling in, and that's from that area of troughing that was off of our coastline as well, and some feeding up from the Bahamas. So that will do it for the tropics discussion. I definitely wanted to get back to our local area. So for a recap for today, we're looking at a southeast build for the Charleston area. I think what we'll have is we'll have lots of streaming moisture coming up into our area from the south. So we'll have to watch for rains and storms to really hammer us again today. Unfortunately, we've had too much rain in the Charleston area, and we're looking at drying out possibly tomorrow. So as we get into tomorrow, let's see, we have southeast winds today, 9 to 13 knots. East-southeast could see 10 to 14 knots. As we get into tomorrow, we see this southerly synoptic flow coming up the coastline, and even the south or south-southwest wind, and we're looking at getting to 14 to 18 knots. And there is some potential for higher numbers than that, especially if we get kicked off a little earlier before noon. If we start to see those numbers climb into the mid-teens, we could be looking at near 20 knots. And as we get into Thursday, we're going to back down a little bit, and we'll say 12 to 16 knots with potential to go 13 to 17 knots off of that same direction of wind, south or south-southwest. And as we get into Friday, we start to see a frontal boundary sort of drape down towards the southeast, and our winds sort of get into a zonal flow, a southwest or west-southwest flow. So we'll have to watch and see what happens with that day to day. Right now, it's a little bit early to call on that for Friday, but I do think that we'll start to see effects from that frontal boundary way ahead. We'll probably see some nocturnal jetting and not so much activity in the daytime as far as moderate wind speeds, more along the lines of modest. And that will do it for the Chucktown Wind Report. Thanks for watching.